Hey everyone, welcome to the Commercial Carrier Corner. I'm your host, Jared Taylor. Joining me today, we have Jamie Greenleaf, the co-founder of Fiduciary In A Box. Jamie, how's it going?
Well, thanks. How are you?
Doing well. Excited to chat with you here today. Let's dive right in. Here on the Commercial Carrier Corner, we tend to talk a lot about employee-sponsored health plans, and you've spent a large chunk of your career advising employers on retirement benefits. I'd love to kind of kick this conversation off. If you could share a little bit about how retirement benefits have progressed during your time in the industry and the risks that still exist for employers.
Absolutely. You're correct. I grew up in the retirement industry. My mother founded a firm back in 1981, kind of when the 401k code was coming to fruition. So when I say grew up, I really grew up in the industry. But for the past 30 years, I've really helped employers establish fiduciarily sound processes to provide better outcomes in the retirement plan. And if you look at kind of what's happened from an industry standpoint, back in the day, employers used to sponsor a defined benefit plan. And these defined benefit plans were meant to allow employees to retire with dignity and provide them with an income for the rest of their lives. And people started living longer. So, what started to happen with these 100% employer sponsored plans is they became an unsustainable benefit because people were living longer. And we also saw Social Security benefits struggling with the same kind of disconnect. They were set up to provide income for a very short period of time, and all of a sudden, people were living 10 and 20 years on Social Security. So the industry had to change, and it brought about the defined contribution plans, where it allowed employers to withhold dollars from employees' paychecks to set them aside for retirement benefits at a later time. Well, ERISA stepped in and said, hey, if you're withholding dollars from your employees' paychecks, you have a responsibility to be prudent stewards of those dollars, and you have a fiduciary responsibility. So employers didn't really understand what fiduciary standard was at that time until the Pension Protection Act of 2006 and the 408B2 regulations, where transparency came to fruition. And employers didn't really have access to a lot of information, and so they were kind of living in a black box. When transparency came to the market, we started to see lawsuits. And those lawsuits really helped employers start to understand what a fiduciary breach could potentially cost them in litigation fees, and just from the standpoint of their employees believing they weren't doing what was in their best interest. And that standard of conduct has really helped employers be more proactive with plan design, get away from challenges like inertia, conflict of interest. They started to understand what that benefit was. And that's helped employees actually save for retirement. So when I got into the industry, the average account balance was running around $17,000 a year. Today, it's about $100,000 a year. Big difference. Employers or participation rates were probably around 60 to 70%. Now participation rates are 80 to 85%. And all of that has benefited all of us as individuals to be able to retire with dignity. But it came with challenges. And now those challenges have been fleshed out. And I think for the majority of employers, they're delivering a real benefit to employees.
When it comes to healthcare benefits and retirement benefits, obviously they're both covered under ERISA. Um, Making these employers a fiduciary to act prudently on behalf of employees. So they say that history repeats itself, and there are some commonalities between retirement benefit lawsuits and recent lawsuits regarding pharmacy benefits filed against Johnson and Johnson in particular, and Wells Fargo. Can you articulate some of those similarities, what they are?
Sure. So in the retirement space, when we started to see the lawsuits, I think there's an old saying from a legendary bank robber, Willie Sutton, I think his name is, and they'd say, why did you rob banks? And he said, well, because that's where the money is. So in the retirement space, when employers weren't acting as prudent fiduciaries, the attorneys went after them. And where did they go? They went after the large employers because that's where the money was. And so what we're seeing in the healthcare space, as this transparency has come to market and employers now have this fiduciary standard that they're going to be held to, which, by the way, they've always had to be a fiduciary on the plan, but really hadn't had access to information to perform that fiduciary duty. We're starting to see litigation against employers for breach of their fiduciary duties. And what we saw in the retirement space was they go after the big boys first because that's where the money is. And that's kind of what we're seeing in the healthcare space. We've got J&J, we have Wells Fargo, we have Mayo Clinic, and those are all large employers with large dollar amounts going into their healthcare plan. So very similar to what we saw in the retirement space.
While this started with large employers in the pharmacy space, how might this progress moving forward? And then a part two to that is, do you think smaller employers will be implicated, and could it progress into health plans alongside pharmacy benefits?
Absolutely. So I think pharmacy benefit managers are kind of have a large target on their back right now from Congress and others, right, wrong, or indifferent. This is kind of low hanging fruit. So the litigation we're seeing right now is around the PBMs. But as attorneys start to move into this space and kind of continue to investigate and discover information about how healthcare plans are being run, they're going to start to see some bad behavior from the healthcare market and the industry as a whole. And it's going to kind of open up the potential litigation for these larger employers. But I also think, and some of us may be thinking, well, great, I'm a small employer, I'm a mid-sized employer, I don't have to worry about this. I kind of disagree because what we're seeing in the healthcare space that was different than what we saw in the retirement space is we see the Department of Labor extremely interested in what's going on in the healthcare market. And they're actually starting to go into these BUCAs and investigate them for behavior that they have. And we saw that in Minnesota where the DOL went into a BUCA in Minnesota and said, hey, you're passing on a provider's tax to your 370 self-insured employers. This is not something that they should be paying. And that was to the tune of $66.8 million. So now you kind of have the DOL in there looking at now 370 employers that were paying something that in their minds was not a fee they should have been paying and was considered perhaps excessive fees. Now you could have the DOL start to audit all of those mid-size employers. So I think the landscape is going to be similar to what we saw in the retirement space, but different because there is a renewed interest from the Department of Labor to fix and right the wrongs that have happened in the healthcare space.
What do you suggest for employers and brokers as a course of action to protect themselves?
So the first thing is acknowledge that they're a fiduciary. If you are a plan sponsor and you sponsor an employer healthcare plan, an employer-sponsored healthcare plan, guess what? You are a fiduciary, not your carrier, not your TPA, not your advisor. You are a fiduciary. So by acknowledging that, you can start to establish things like a fiduciary committee. You can start to gather information and understand where your conflicts may potentially be within the relationships that you have. You can start to gather data and actually act on the data that you're receiving. So the first step that an employer should do right off the bat is acknowledge that they're a fiduciary, establish fiduciary liability insurance on that committee that's handling the decisions on the healthcare plan. And if you're a broker, don't think you might get off scot-free. You're going to have to kind of look at what are you doing? Are you potentially acting as a functional fiduciary? are you potentially conflicted and could be called out in a lawsuit. So you may have to change the way that you're doing business, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's if you kind of hide under the desk and say this isn't going to affect me, you're probably not going to be around in 5 to 10 years, and maybe even shorter. But if you're one that embraces this and said, change is here, I'm ready to be transparent, I'm going to outline exactly what my services are, I think you have a really good shot of grabbing market share because employers need help with this very complex benefit. That said, we have no idea what the courts are going to do moving forward. And until a couple of these cases go through the court system, we don't know what they're going to look for fiduciaries to actually do on their healthcare plan. We can only speculate based upon what we've been told that, hey, go back to what you do on your retirement plan. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I mean, we should definitely have you come back on at some point, especially as more of these get settled and we have more information, right? That you can go provide your commentary on what's happening. But I really appreciate you coming on here today, sharing some thoughts with us on where the space is and where it's heading, and really excited to continue the conversation in the future.
Thanks for having me.